Molotow marker is definitely the strangest graffiti marker I have seen in a long time. And you might say, Sciz, why? It looks like a normal, albeit pretty wide, chisel tip marker. Well, on the outside, it looks pretty standard, I'll give you that, but that is why today we are doing a full tagging test with this 30mm chisel tip tank marker by Molotow and taking a look at everything there is to see about it. So first I want to show you why this Molotow 612 here is not like other chisel tip markers. And to do that, we're actually going to open it up here. I want to quickly show you exactly how this marker works because there's very little information out there that I could actually find just about how it actually does its thing. So firstly, this is not a pump action marker. It's not a pump action chisel tip marker like, say, your grog cutters would be or anything similar to that. There is no compressible valve there. So how does it work then? Well, it's a little more old school than it appears actually. We're gonna start from the back. It's got this patented refill from the back system, so we can screw that right off. But when you open it up, it's not an empty marker reservoir that you're seeing there. You're seeing what they're obscurely labeling as a tampon system marker, but I'll show you what this actually is inside of it. If we take the lid off here, you can see the 30mm chisel tip. It's actually quite thin on the opposing axis there, but we're gonna pop that right out to the classic T-shaped nib there. And then we'll twist off the part here that secures the nib in place, and once you do that, you are left with this. You can see on screen where the nib was pressing into this sort of spongy sponge. If I pop this right out here, you can see that this is basically an absorbent sponge with a non-absorbent layer on the outside that keeps the ink that you put in this marker flowing from the back to the front and into the nib there. In short, this is the flow regulation mechanism for this marker. If you didn't know, this system is actually what almost all small markers use as a flow regulation system as well. For example, I've got these Copic markers here. These use that exact same system, and it's a much more common system to see in markers this size. But it is absolutely not a common flow regulation system to see for a 30mm chisel tip marker. That is just bonkers to me. But let's not waste any time. We're gonna get this filled up here with some ink and head over and see how it tags in our testing area. Alright, so with this Molotow 612 marker here, you want to fill it up fairly slowly. Actually, it's not like other markers that just have reservoirs where you can dump your ink or paint in. You want to specifically fill it only inside the spongy part. If you get any on the outside of the spongy part, it's just going to run down the side of the marker and sort of get in the threads of the marker, make it a little bit messy, hard to deal with. It might even function worse than it would otherwise, so you just have to fill it to the point of saturation, let it drip down and slowly flow down that spongy part of the marker, fill it a bit more. It honestly takes probably about 5 minutes to fill. It sort of sucks. That being said, once it starts to be fully saturated, you're gonna get that nice juicy nib right there. It flows right down, it gets the whole nib. That's really nice. Some T-shaped nib markers, the T just will not fill up all the way, but that's not the case with this. This has done that very, very well. It does say you should only use Molotow inks in these. We did not do that. We used a dang ink and it worked just fine. What they are saying though, I think, is you want to use your thinner inks. It does have to flow through a fairly dense T-shaped chisel tip nib, so be careful with that. So right now on our testing surface here, we have a beautiful testing surface for this chisel tip marker. This is sort of the ideal surface for chisel tips, I like to think. But we're going to start tagging up some subscribers' names who have asked me for hit-offs. If you want to see your name consistently up in my videos, in my reviews, you can go check out the Patreon page there. You'll get consistent hit-offs in the videos, as well as a lot of exclusive content over there. I think it's like $3 a month right now for those who want to go over and support. It's linked in the description and in the corner. But while we tag these names up here, I'm really concerned with one main thing, and that is how does this marker flow? Because the flow system here is what's different than the normal pump action markers. Is it messy? Does it flow properly? Does it flow fast enough that you can consistently get your tags up when you want to do a tag with them. That's what we want to see here. And once we find that out, I'll be able to give you guys a final verdict on if this is a graffiti certified marker made for graffiti writers, or if it's one of those Molotow products that probably should be left to the fine artists out there. So let's get to it. Alright guys, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't have high hopes for this. A lot of the Molotow products, they have such a massive product depth that a lot of them really veer into the fine artist category and sort of away from the graffiti artist category. That's sort of what I was expecting with this. That being said, I was really impressed right away with the constant, consistent flow. I was expecting that maybe just the flow would not be able to keep up for us graffiti artists out there trying to use this as a legitimate tagging tool. But no, this thing is great. It's consistent. I can see why they're calling it a tank marker. It really does hold a lot of juice in there, and it spits it out at a perfectly okay rate. I expected it to be messier than it was as well, just because I expected it to either sort of drip out of the nib eventually, but no. If you just take your time and I think fill it up properly, like you would with any smaller marker like the Copics, it just writes like a nice normal marker, just way bigger. And hey, that's what us graffiti artists need, especially if we want to use a massive chisel tip like this. The only part of it that I did find a little bit messy and irritating was the cap. So the cap, it needs to house a 30mm nib, so it's quite big. It's not going to fit on the opposite end of your marker, so you do have to sit there holding it in your other hand like a bit of an idiot. That being said, if you are using this for tagging applications, you're probably just going to take the cap off, do a tag or two maybe, and then you put the cap back on. It's not a big deal if you have to hold it for the time span of 1 or 2 tags, right? The only thing about the cap is that being that it's just marginally wider than that 30mm chisel tip, you do have to put it back on, and the sides of the cap are going to hit the nib, and it starts to get a little bit messy around the edges after a little bit. That's to be expected. This is graffiti, right guys? So the constant flow, very suitable for graffiti artists. The 30mm aspect of this mop, very underrated, I think, because these 30mm markers offer you a very good range of surfaces that you can write on in terms of size. You can go big, obviously, but if you're careful, you can actually do some fairly small stuff as well, like the Kona tag. You know, it's big enough, but you can also make that size tag with a 10mm drip mop. So it gives you a lot of variety if you're a graffiti artist as well, in terms of the size of surface you can cover with this. If you're the type of graffiti writer that has to have those drips, you know, stay away from this. That's all I can really say. This isn't going to be something that gets you drips. You can't even force compress the nib if you wanted to. It gives you a consistent flow, not an overpowering one where you're going to get drips the way you might want to. In that sense, not the best for all graffiti artists, but that's definitely down to personal preference. The chisel tip quality, it's very dense, so again, be mindful what you're filling it with. You want a nice thin ink. Like I said, we use the Dang inks for this one in particular. If you want to know more about them, you can check the video in the corner. It's in the description too, I'm sure. And the last box I wanted to tick with this marker is it clean enough to be carryable as a graffiti artist? Well, you know, I've found so far that when I had it just sitting on my desk, I expected it to start dripping down, dripping out of the nib, and it hasn't happened. And I think that's partly because of how dense this nib is. It can hold a lot. Also, if you have saturated the sponge properly in the tank system, you haven't oversaturated, I don't really think you're going to see much leakage. So yes, this is carryable if you're a graffiti artist. So honestly, I didn't think it was going to be that straightforward for this marker. I'm really impressed with it overall, but let me sit down with you and tell you what kinds of things graffiti artists might want to use this for, in case there's a few things you haven't thought of that I may have. Okay, so the Molotow 612 30mm chisel tip tank marker here. What we have here is a marker that is good for graffiti artists in quite a few ways, actually. The size of it, you want to get up big, right? If you only had this with you, you could be seen. It's the type of thing that has a large variety of size surface that you could write on with this. That's the first plus here for graffiti artists. It's got a very big tag size too. I would imagine you can get a lot of tags out of this before you start needing to refill it. It's clean enough you can carry it with you. That's a big one for graffiti artists, right? The only messy aspect of it, like I said, is the cap a little bit. The only big con for some graffiti artists is that this is not the type of thing you want to get drips with. You just physically can't. So this checks a lot of boxes for the graffiti artist in an environment with lots of smooth surfaces. These chisel tips can make your style look really, really strong if you know a little bit about calligraphy. Try and use them in that calligraphic style. My tags were not the best example of that. I struggle with the calligraphy still today even, but it's a great style of writing to get to know a little bit better. If you want to check out a more classic graffiti-oriented chisel tip marker, I mentioned earlier the Grog Cutter. I've also got the Grog Cutter Mini here. These are obviously well used. It's a good one to know about, and it has that classic pump action marker. If you want to see our full review and surface tagging test that we did of it, that video will be on screen for you to check out right now. I hope to see you over there soon. Until then,